To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Shattered Glass, Shattered Illusions. Lewis Spears had built his life on precision. Every detail of his construction empire, every relationship, every moment calculated with the same methodical approach that had transformed him from a small-town contractor into one of Pennsylvania's most successful developers. At 42, his weathered hands told stories of honest work, but his sharp gray eyes held the intelligence of a man who understood that success required more than sweat. It demanded strategy. The Mercedes sedan lay twisted against the highway guardrail like a broken toy, steam rising from its crumpled hood into the cold October air. Lewis stood in the wreckage, his legs shaking not from the crash, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. 20 minutes earlier, they'd been driving home from Jake's baseball game. His 14-year-old son had pitched a no-hitter, and Susie had actually put down her phone long enough to cheer. "Your wife is conscious, but your son, it's serious," the paramedic said, her voice cutting through the chaos of sirens and flashing lights. "We need to get him to Children's Hospital immediately." Lewis watched as they loaded Jake onto a stretcher, his boy's face pale against the white sheet. Susie stood near the ambulance, speaking rapidly to a state trooper, her blonde hair disheveled but her voice steady. Even in crisis, she maintained that composed exterior that had first attracted him 15 years ago when she was a paralegal at his attorney's office. While Susie gave her statement about the deer that had supposedly caused them to swerve, Lewis retrieved Jake's baseball equipment from the wreckage. His son's backpack had been thrown clear, its contents scattered across the asphalt. As he gathered the notebooks and pens, a small piece of paper fluttered to the ground, stained with drops of blood from Jake's split lip. The handwriting was unmistakably his son's, careful, deliberate letters formed with the same precision Lewis had taught him. "Dad, the real reason Mommy goes to those late meetings isn't work. She's been lying to you about Mr. Delaney from my school. I saw them in his car last Thursday when you thought I was at practice. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I was scared you'd hate me too." Lewis read the note 3 times before the words fully registered. Richard Delaney, Jake's guidance counselor, the man who'd been coming to their house for academic consultations, the same man Susie claimed was helping with some education initiative at her law firm. The same man Lewis had personally thanked for taking such a special interest in Jake's future. His hands didn't shake as he folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The trembling in his legs had stopped entirely, replaced by something cold and calculating. Lewis Spears had built his fortune by identifying structural weaknesses before they became catastrophic failures. Now he was looking at the greatest structural failure of his life, and unlike the buildings he constructed, this couldn't be repaired. "Mr. Spears?" The state trooper approached, notepad in hand. "We'll need your statement about the accident." Lewis glanced at Susie, who was now on her phone, likely calling her sister Martha. His wife's face showed appropriate concern for their injured son, but Lewis noticed how her fingers moved across the screen, not dialing a number, but typing a message. To whom? At what should have been the most terrifying moment of any parent's life, Susie was texting someone. "Of course, officer," Lewis replied, his voice steady. "My wife saw it happen. A deer ran into the road, and she swerved to avoid it. I was looking at my son in the back seat at the time." It was a lie, but Lewis had learned early in business that sometimes the truth was a luxury you couldn't afford. He'd been watching Susie's reflection in the passenger window when she jerked the wheel, startled by her phone buzzing with what was undoubtedly another message from her lover. There had been no deer. As they rode to the hospital in separate ambulances, Lewis with Jake, Susie following in the second unit, Lewis made his first decision. He wouldn't confront his wife immediately. He wouldn't demand explanations or give her the chance to craft lies. Instead, he would do what he'd always done when facing a complex demolition project: study the structure, identify the load-bearing elements, and then bring it down systematically. Jake remained unconscious during the 20-minute ride, his breathing steady, but his left arm clearly broken. The paramedic assured Lewis that head injuries in teenagers often looked worse than they were, but Lewis barely heard him. His mind was already working, calculating timelines and opportunities. How long had this been going on? How many of those late meetings had been lies? How many times had Richard Delaney sat at their dinner table, accepting Lewis's hospitality while planning to destroy his family. At the hospital, Lewis called his brother-in-law, Scott Ogden, who arrived within an hour. Scott was a private investigator, a former cop who'd helped Lewis with background checks on major construction contracts. More importantly, Scott was family, married to Lewis's sister Laura, and he understood that some problems required solutions that existed outside legal boundaries. "I need you to look into something for me," Lewis said quietly as they stood in the hospital corridor, watching doctors examine Jake through the window. But not a word to Laura yet. Scott studied his brother-in-law's face. They'd known each other for 20 years, and he recognized the expression. Lewis Spears in planning mode was a dangerous man to cross. "What do you need?" Lewis handed him the bloody note. Scott read it twice, his jaw tightening. "Jesus, Lewis. How long do you think?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out everything." Lewis's voice was barely above a whisper, but the intensity behind it made Scott take a step back. "I want to know where they go, when they meet, what they say to each other. I want to know what lies she's told me and what lies she's told him. I want to know if my son is the only one who figured it out." And then, Lewis looked through the window at Jake, who was finally stirring on the examination table. His son's eyes opened, confused and frightened, searching the room until they found his father. Lewis raised his hand in a small wave, and Jake managed a weak smile. "Then I'm going to teach them both what it means to betray someone who never forgives." Chapter 2. The Weight of Secrets. Jake's arm would heal in 6 weeks, the doctors assured them, and the concussion was mild. By midnight, they were home, Jake sleeping peacefully in his room with pain medication, Susie finally off her phone and making tea in their kitchen. Lewis sat in his study, ostensibly reviewing construction contracts, but actually watching his wife through the partially open door. She moved through their home with familiar ease, touching objects they'd chosen together, arranging flowers Lewis had bought her just 3 days earlier. The normalcy of it felt surreal. In the space of 6 hours, Lewis's understanding of his life had been completely demolished, but the furniture remained in the same places, the photographs still smiled from their frames, and his wife still hummed softly while she worked. "Lewis." Susie appeared in his doorway, holding 2 cups of chamomile tea. "You should get some rest. It's been a hell of a day." He accepted the tea and studied her face. Susie was 38, still beautiful in the way that had made him feel fortunate every day for 15 years. Her green eyes showed genuine concern, and when she placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch felt real and warm. Either she was an exceptional actress, or some part of her genuinely cared about their family, even while she was destroying it. "I keep thinking about Jake's note," Lewis said carefully. "The one he was writing when we crashed." Susie's hand stilled for just a moment. "What note?" "For his English class. About honesty and trust. The irony isn't lost on me." Lewis sipped his tea and watched for her reaction. He wrote about how lies always surface eventually, how the truth has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it. "He's always been perceptive," Susie said, but Lewis caught the slight relief in her voice. She thought he was talking about a school assignment, not the confession that was now secured in his safe upstairs. Too perceptive sometimes. He notices things adults think they're hiding. Lewis set down his cup and met her eyes. "I worry about what he might have seen or heard that he's not telling us." For the first time since the accident, Susie looked genuinely uncomfortable. "What do you mean?" "Kids see everything, Susie. They watch their parents, they listen to conversations, they pick up on tension even when we think we're hiding it." Lewis leaned back in his chair, maintaining casual body language while his words carried deliberate weight. "Sometimes I wonder if Jake knows more about our marriage than we realize." Susie's laugh sounded forced. "You're being paranoid. Jake's a typical teenager, too busy with sports and friends to worry about his boring parents." "Maybe you're right." Lewis stood and kissed her forehead, tasting the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with something else, a cologne he didn't recognize. "I'm going to check on him before bed." Jake was awake when Lewis entered his room, staring at the ceiling with his good arm behind his head. The cast on his left arm was already covered with signatures from the nurses, but his face was serious beyond his 14 years. "Dad, are you okay? You look different." Lewis sat on the edge of the bed. His son had inherited his gray eyes and his ability to read people, dangerous qualities in someone so young. "I'm fine, buddy. Just worried about you." "I'm okay." Jake shifted uncomfortably. Dad, about that note. Later, Lewis said quietly. When you're feeling better, we'll talk about everything. But not tonight. Jake nodded, understanding passing between them. His son was smart enough to recognize that some conversations required privacy and planning. It was a quality Lewis admired and feared in equal measure. Over the next 3 days, Lewis maintained his normal routine while Scott Ogden began his investigation. Lewis went to construction sites, attended meetings, and came home for family dinners. He helped Jake with his homework, discussed upcoming projects with Susie, and played the role of devoted husband and father with Oscar-worthy performance. But beneath the surface, he was cataloging every detail. Susie's phone habits, how she angled it away from him when typing, how she'd suddenly developed a passion for evening walks that always coincided with mysterious calls. Her excuses for late meetings had become more elaborate, involving clients Lewis had never heard of and legal issues that seemed to require an unusual amount of after-hours attention. Most telling were the small changes in their physical relationship. Susie had always been affectionate, but now her kisses felt perfunctory, her touch distracted. She'd started showering immediately when she came home from her meetings, claiming the office air conditioning made her feel grimy. She'd also developed new preferences in bed, techniques and positions that seemed suspiciously expert for someone who'd claimed to learn them from magazine articles. On Thursday evening, Scott called with his preliminary findings. They meet twice a week, usually at the Marriott downtown. Tuesdays and Thursdays, always between 6 and 8 p.m. She tells you she's working late, but her car's been spotted in the hotel parking garage. Lewis felt something cold settle in his chest. How long? Credit card records show she's been paying for the room for 8 months. Always the same suite, always charged to her personal card. 8 months. Lewis did the math quickly. It had started just after Jake began high school, just after Richard Delaney had become his guidance counselor. The timing wasn't coincidental. There's more, Scott continued. Delaney's been having financial problems. Divorce finalized 6 months ago, expensive settlement. He's been moonlighting as a tutor for wealthy families, charging premium rates for academic consulting. Are you saying he targeted us? I'm saying a man with money problems who gained access to wealthy families through his school position might not limit his extracurricular activities to education. Lewis hung up and walked to his study window, looking out at the suburban street where he'd thought he was building a perfect life. Every house held families with their own secrets, their own betrayals, their own carefully constructed lies. But his family's destruction felt uniquely personal, crafted specifically to cause maximum damage. That night, he waited until Susie was asleep before retrieving Jake's note from his safe. He read it again, noting details he'd missed in the initial shock. His son had been carrying this secret for weeks, maybe longer. Jake had watched his mother lie to his father, had seen the evidence of her betrayal, and had struggled with whether to reveal the truth. The weight of that burden on a 14-year-old boy's shoulders made Lewis's carefully controlled anger transform into something much more dangerous. Susie had betrayed their marriage, but involving Jake, forcing their son to choose between protecting his father or keeping his mother's secrets, was unforgivable. Lewis returned the note to the safe and made his second decision. This wouldn't be about divorce courts or financial settlements. This would be about justice, and justice required a more personal approach. Chapter 3. Architecture of Revenge. Friday morning brought unseasonably warm weather for October, and Lewis stood on the roof of his latest construction project, a 30-story office complex in downtown Pittsburgh, watching the city spread out below him. From this height, people looked like ants following predictable patterns, each believing their individual dramas were significant while remaining oblivious to the larger forces shaping their lives. His phone buzzed with a text from Susie. Late meeting tonight. Don't wait up. Order pizza for you and Jake. Lewis smiled, typing back. No problem. Hope the client isn't too demanding. You know how it is with these corporate types. They want everything perfect. Perfect. Lewis deleted the conversation and called Scott. Tonight's Thursday. Are they meeting? Already confirmed. Same suite, same time. She booked it for 3 hours this time instead of the usual 2. I want pictures. Not for legal purposes, for leverage. Lewis, you need to think about this carefully. Whatever you're planning. I'm thinking carefully. More carefully than I've thought about anything in my life. Lewis walked to the edge of the roof, looking down at the construction workers who trusted him to keep them safe, to make decisions that protected their livelihoods and their families. Do you know what the most important principle in construction is, Scott? Foundation. Load distribution. You identify where the weight is concentrated, and you make sure the structure can handle it. But if you want to bring something down, you do the opposite. You concentrate all the stress on the weakest point until it fails catastrophically. Scott was quiet for a long moment. What's the weakest point in their structure? Their arrogance. They think they're smarter than everyone else, that they've planned for every contingency. But they've made one crucial error, which is, they underestimated me. That evening, Louis helped Jake with his algebra homework while Susie prepared for her meeting. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue dress that was professional enough for actual business but flattering enough for other purposes. Louis complimented her appearance and kissed her goodbye, playing his role perfectly. After she left, Louis and Jake ordered pizza and settled in to watch a movie. But halfway through, Louis paused the film. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." His son tensed, recognizing the seriousness in his father's voice. "Okay, how long have you known about your mother and Mr. Delaney?" Jake's face went pale. "Dad, I found your note in the wreckage. I'm not angry with you, but I need to know everything." The story came out in halting sentences. Jake had forgotten his science textbook after school and had gone back to retrieve it. He'd seen his mother's car in the faculty parking lot and had gone to find her, thinking she was there for a parent conference. Instead, he'd discovered her in Richard Delaney's classroom, and their interaction had been distinctly unprofessional. "I didn't know what to do," Jake said, his voice cracking. "I wanted to tell you, but I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was just—" "You weren't wrong," Louis said gently. "And you're not responsible for any of this. Are you going to divorce her?" Louis studied his son's face. Jake was trying to appear strong, but Louis could see the fear underneath. Despite everything, Jake loved his mother, and he was terrified of his family disintegrating. "I'm going to handle this situation," Louis said carefully, "but not in the way you might expect." Over the weekend, Louis refined his plan. He'd spent his career understanding how systems worked, how to build them, how to repair them, and how to dismantle them efficiently. Every structure had pressure points, and every person had vulnerabilities that could be exploited with the right approach. Richard Delaney was ambitious but insecure, desperate to maintain his position at the prestigious private school where Jake was enrolled. He'd worked hard to build his reputation as a dedicated educator, someone who went above and beyond for his students. His divorce had been messy and public, making him sensitive about his professional image. Susie was proud and controlling, someone who needed to feel intelligent and sophisticated. She'd built her identity around being the perfect wife and mother while pursuing her own career ambitions. Her affair wasn't just about passion. It was about feeling powerful and desired in a way that domestic life couldn't provide. Both of them believed they were untouchable because they'd been careful. They met in a hotel where they weren't known, they used discretion in public, and they assumed their secret was safe because they were dealing with a trusting husband and an ignorant child. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Monday morning, Louis called Richard Delaney's office and scheduled a meeting. "I'd like to discuss Jake's college preparation," he told the secretary. "I have some specific concerns about his guidance counselor's approach." The appointment was set for Thursday afternoon, immediately after what Louis knew would be another hotel rendezvous. Delaney would be tired, possibly careless, certainly not expecting a confrontation from the husband he'd been cuckolding for 8 months. Tuesday, Louis hired a second private investigator, one with different specialties than Scott. Where Scott focused on surveillance and documentation, Harold Johnson specialized in digital forensics and social engineering. Louis wanted to know everything: email accounts, text messages, social media interactions, financial transactions. If Susie and Delaney had communicated electronically, Louis would have records of every word. By Wednesday evening, Louis had a complete picture of the affair. The evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of explicit text messages, hotel receipts, photographs they'd taken of each other, even a detailed calendar of their meetings. But more importantly, Louis had discovered the deeper truth about their relationship. This wasn't a passionate love affair. It was a calculated arrangement that served both their needs while requiring minimal emotional investment. Susie got excitement and validation, Delaney got access to Lewis's social and business connections. They'd been using each other as much as they'd been betraying Lewis. That knowledge transformed Lewis's anger into something colder and more focused. He wasn't dealing with star-crossed lovers who'd been overcome by irresistible attraction. He was dealing with two selfish people who'd made a deliberate choice to destroy his family for their own convenience. Thursday afternoon, Lewis sat in Richard Delaney's office and studied the man who'd been sleeping with his wife. Delaney was younger than Lewis by 5 years, with the kind of polished appearance that came from careful grooming and expensive clothes. He was handsome in a generic way, the type of man who'd learned to use his looks and charm to get what he wanted. "Mr. Spears, thank you for coming in. I understand you have some concerns about Jake's academic trajectory." Lewis smiled. "Actually, I want to discuss a different kind of trajectory. The one that's going to end your career, destroy your reputation, and leave you unemployed and unemployable." Delaney's practiced smile faltered. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "Of course you do." Lewis placed a manila folder on the desk between them. 8 months, Richard. Room 412 at the Marriott. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6 to 8 p.m. Sometimes longer when you're feeling particularly energetic. The color drained from Delaney's face as he opened the folder and saw the photographs. Lewis had chosen the most explicit ones, images that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. "I could destroy you with these today," Lewis continued conversationally. "One email to the school board, one post on social media, one conversation with the right parent, and your career is finished. But that would be too easy. What do you want? I want you to understand that your life now belongs to me. Every decision you make, every word you speak, every action you take will be determined by what I allow you to do." Lewis leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And if you ever touch my wife again, if you ever speak to my son again, if you even look at my family again, I will make sure that what I've shown you today looks merciful compared to what comes next." Lewis stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Richard, tomorrow you're going to resign from this school. Personal reasons, effective immediately. I'll be watching to make sure you follow through." As Lewis walked back to his car, he felt the first stirring of satisfaction he'd experienced since reading Jake's note. Phase 1 was complete. Delaney would spend the next several days in agony, waiting for the other shoe to drop, before realizing that Lewis's revenge would be a slow burn rather than a quick explosion. Now it was time to turn his attention to his wife. Chapter 4. The Perfect Trap. Lewis had always believed that the most devastating attacks came from directions the victim never saw coming. In construction, the catastrophic failures weren't caused by obvious problems like storms or earthquakes. They were caused by hidden structural weaknesses that accumulated stress until they reached a breaking point. Friday morning, Susie was unusually agitated. She'd been trying to reach Richard Delaney since Thursday evening, but her calls were going straight to voicemail and her texts remained unanswered. Lewis watched her pace their kitchen, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline to a sinking ship. "Everything all right?" Lewis asked, not looking up from his morning paper. "Just some issues with Jake's college planning. His guidance counselor seems to have gone MIA. That's unprofessional. Maybe you should speak to the principal." Susie's laugh was tight and forced. "I'm sure it's nothing serious. He's probably just dealing with a family emergency." By noon, news had spread through the school community that Richard Delaney had submitted his resignation, citing personal reasons and the need to pursue other opportunities. Lewis received a call from the principal himself, Dr. Ernest Elder, apologizing for the disruption and assuring him that Jake's college preparation wouldn't be affected. That evening, Susie was a wreck. She'd spent the day crafting increasingly desperate messages to her lover, alternating between concern for his well-being and barely contained panic about what his sudden disappearance might mean for their secret. Lewis found her in their bedroom, staring at her phone with the expression of someone watching their world collapse. "The strangest thing happened today," Lewis said, sitting on the edge of their bed. "Jake's guidance counselor resigned. Just up and quit without any warning." Susie's fingers tightened around her phone. "Really? That is strange. I'm actually relieved. I never fully trusted him." "Why not?" Lewis shrugged. "Just a feeling. Something about him seemed opportunistic. Like he was always looking for an angle, always trying to figure out how to profit from his position. That's a pretty harsh judgment based on a feeling. Maybe. But I've learned to trust my instincts about people." Lewis turned to face her directly. "Especially when it comes to protecting our family. Saturday morning brought the next phase of Lewis's plan. While Susie attended her regular yoga class, one of the few activities she actually did attend regularly, Lewis met with Harold Johnson at a coffee shop downtown. "I've got everything you asked for," Harold said, sliding a tablet across the table. Text messages, emails, photos they sent each other, even some video calls. "It's all here." Lewis scrolled through the evidence, his expression remaining carefully neutral despite the intimate details of his wife's betrayal laid out in digital clarity. The messages revealed not just their physical affair, but their emotional connection, or lack thereof. Susie had complained about Lewis repeatedly, describing him as predictable and boring, while Delaney had shared details about other wealthy families he'd cultivated relationships with through his position at the school. "There's something else," Harold continued. "Delaney's been suspended from his teaching license, pending an investigation into inappropriate relationships with parents." Anonymous tip came in Thursday evening. Lewis smiled. "Imagine that. The complaint specifically mentioned your wife. Seems someone provided evidence of their affair to the state education board. How unfortunate for both of them. Lewis, there's no going back from this. Once this investigation is official, it becomes public record. Everyone will know." Good. That afternoon, Lewis implemented the next stage of his plan. He called Susie's sister Martha Plummer, who lived 2 hours away in Philadelphia and had always disapproved of her younger sister's marriage to a blue-collar contractor. Martha had made it clear over the years that she believed Susie had married beneath her station and deserved better than life in suburban Pittsburgh. "Martha, I need to ask you something confidential," Lewis said, adopting the worried tone of a concerned husband. "Has Susie mentioned anything to you about being unhappy in our marriage?" "Why do you ask? She's been distant lately, secretive. I'm worried she might be having second thoughts about our life together." Martha's silence was telling. "Lewis, I think you should talk to Susie directly about this. I've tried, but she insists everything is fine. I just want to make sure I'm not missing something important. If she's unhappy, I want to fix it before it's too late." It was a masterful performance. Lewis knew that Martha would immediately call Susie, ostensibly to warn her that Lewis was becoming suspicious, but actually accelerating Susie's panic. The guilt and fear would compound, making her more likely to make mistakes. Sunday evening, Lewis received the call he'd been expecting. Susie announced that she needed to attend an emergency client meeting in Philadelphia and would be staying overnight at Martha's house. It was obviously a lie. Lewis had already confirmed through Harold's digital surveillance that Susie had been desperately trying to arrange a meeting with Delaney, who was still refusing to respond to her communications. "That's a shame," Lewis said. "I was hoping we could spend some quiet time together. Just the two of us." Rain check. Susie kissed his cheek, but Lewis noticed how she avoided eye contact. "I'll make it up to you when I get back." After she left, Lewis called Scott. "She's running. Probably going to Martha's to figure out her next move. Are you ready for phase 3? "More than ready." Monday morning, Lewis did something he'd never done in his 20 years of marriage. He called in sick to work and spent the day in his wife's office. Susie worked for a mid-sized law firm specializing in corporate litigation, and her absence gave Lewis the opportunity to have some very interesting conversations with her colleagues. He met with her boss, Andre Herrera, ostensibly to surprise Susie for their anniversary. In the course of their conversation, Lewis casually mentioned how proud he was of Susie's dedication to her evening client meetings and weekend consultations. "Evening meetings?" Andre looked confused. "Susie hasn't had any client meetings outside regular business hours in months. We've been trying to reduce overtime across the board." "Oh, she must have been working on continuing education then. Professional development courses, that sort of thing." "Not that I'm aware of." "Lewis, is everything okay? You seem—" "Everything's fine," Lewis assured him. "I must have misunderstood what she was telling me." But the seed was planted. Andre Herrera was now wondering what his employee had actually been doing during all those hours she'd claimed to be working late. When Susie returned, she'd face questions about her time management and her truthfulness with her employer. Tuesday, Lewis received a text from Susie. "Need a few more days to sort out this client situation. Missing you and Jake." Lewis responded, "Take all the time you need. Jake and I are managing fine." It was the truth. Jake had actually seemed more relaxed with his mother gone, no longer carrying the weight of her secret. Father and son had spent Monday evening working on a model airplane, talking about everything except the elephant in the room. "Dad," Jake had asked as they painted the wing struts, "are you and Mom going to be okay?" "I don't know, buddy. But whatever happens, you and I are going to be fine. I don't want you to blame yourself for not telling me sooner," Lewis had continued. "You're not responsible for adult problems. Your job is to be a kid and focus on your own life. But I could have prevented." "No, you couldn't have. This situation existed long before you discovered it, and it would have continued whether you told me or not. The only thing your honesty did was give me the information I needed to protect our family." Wednesday brought the next revelation. Lewis was at Jake's school for a parent-teacher conference when Dr. Elder approached him in the hallway. "Mr. Spears, I wanted to update you on the Richard Delaney situation. I'm afraid it's more serious than we initially realized." "Oh." "The state investigation has uncovered evidence of inappropriate relationships with multiple parents. It appears Mr. Delaney was using his position to gain access to wealthy families for purposes that went well beyond educational guidance." Lewis arranged his expression to show appropriate shock and concern. "Are you saying Jake was at risk?" "Not your son specifically, but the families involved. The investigation is ongoing, but it looks like this pattern of behavior has been consistent throughout his tenure here." "How many families?" "At least four that we know of. The authorities are still gathering evidence." Lewis left the school with confirmation of what he'd suspected. Susie wasn't Richard Delaney's only target. She was simply one of several wealthy wives he'd seduced as part of a broader pattern of exploitation. The knowledge didn't diminish Lewis's anger, but it added another layer to his understanding of the situation. His wife hadn't been swept away by passion or love. She'd been manipulated by a predator who specialized in identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities in marriages. Susie's dissatisfaction with her suburban life, her need for excitement and validation, her belief that she deserved more than what Lewis could provide, all of it had made her the perfect victim for Richard Delaney's practiced seduction. But understanding the dynamics didn't create forgiveness. If anything, it intensified Lewis's resolve. Susie had chosen to believe Delaney's lies because they told her what she wanted to hear. She'd chosen to betray her family because the alternative required her to confront her own dissatisfaction and work to improve her marriage. Those were choices, not mistakes. And choices had consequences. Thursday evening, Lewis made his final preparations. Susie would return home Friday afternoon, expecting to resume her normal life while figuring out how to reconnect with her lover. She had no idea that her normal life no longer existed, that Lewis had been systematically dismantling the foundation of their shared existence while she'd been hiding at her sister's house. Lewis spent the evening organizing his evidence into carefully labeled files. Every photograph, every text message, every financial record was cataloged and cross-referenced. But the evidence wasn't meant for divorce court. It was meant for maximum psychological impact. Friday morning, Lewis called his attorney, Stanley Cohen, a man who'd handled his business contracts for 15 years and understood that some problems required solutions that existed in legal gray areas. "Stanley, I need you to prepare divorce papers. Complete dissolution, full custody of Jake, division of assets according to the prenuptial agreement." "Lewis, what's going on?" "You and Susie seemed." "That's the point. We seemed happy because I didn't know my wife was sleeping with another man for 8 months. Stanley's silence stretched long enough that Lewis wondered if the connection had been lost. "Jesus, do you have evidence?" "More than enough. But Stanley, I don't want to file these papers yet. I want to use them strategically. What do you have in mind?" "I'm going to give Susie the opportunity to confess. If she comes clean, tells me the truth about everything, and agrees to my terms for moving forward, maybe we can handle this privately. And if she doesn't, then I'll make sure her betrayal becomes public knowledge in the most devastating way possible." Lewis hung up and looked around his study, noting all the personal touches Susie had added over the years: family photographs, decorative objects, artwork she'd chosen for their shared life. By tomorrow evening, she would understand that their shared life was over, and the only question remaining was whether her destruction would be private or public. The choice would be entirely hers. Chapter 5. The Confession. Susie returned home Friday afternoon looking like a woman who'd spent 5 days in emotional turmoil. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and she moved through their house with the uncertain steps of someone who no longer felt at home in her own space. Louis greeted her with a kiss and helped carry her bags upstairs, playing the role of concerned husband while studying her body language for signs of how desperate she'd become. Susie was a careful person, someone who planned every detail of her life, and her inability to contact Richard Delaney had clearly shattered her confidence. "How was your trip?" Louis asked as they unpacked her suitcase together. "Stressful. The client's situation is more complicated than I thought." Susie's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly as she folded her clothes. "I might need to make a few more trips to sort everything out." "Of course, whatever you need to do." That evening, Louis suggested they have dinner at Giovanni's, the Italian restaurant where they'd had their first date 16 years earlier. Susie agreed, probably hoping that a return to familiar territory might help her regain her emotional footing. She dressed carefully, choosing a black dress that Louis had always complimented, and applied her makeup with the precision of someone preparing for battle. Over appetizers, Louis guided the conversation toward their early relationship, reminiscing about their courtship and the dreams they'd shared when they were young and everything seemed possible. Susie relaxed visibly, smiling genuine smiles for the first time since returning home. "Remember when you said you wanted to travel to Italy for our honeymoon?" Louis asked, twirling linguine on his fork. "You had that guidebook, and you'd marked all the places you wanted to visit." "We never made it to Italy," Susie said, a note of wistfulness in her voice. "We could still go? It's not too late to chase old dreams." For a moment, Susie's expression showed genuine regret, as if she were remembering the woman she'd been before her life became complicated by secrets and lies. But then her phone buzzed with a text message, and Louis watched her face change as she read it. "Work?" he asked innocently. "Yes. Just follow-up questions about the Philadelphia situation." Louis nodded and continued eating, but he'd seen enough. Susie was still trying to contact Delaney, still hoping to re-establish their connection. Her trip to Martha's house hadn't been about figuring out how to save her marriage. It had been about figuring out how to continue her affair. After dinner, they drove home in comfortable silence, but Louis could sense Susie's distraction. She kept checking her phone, and when they reached their house, she excused herself to make a call about work issues that couldn't wait until morning. Louis gave her privacy, settling in his study with a book while listening to her pacing footsteps in the room above. Through the ceiling, he could hear the rise and fall of her voice, the desperation barely contained beneath her professional tone. She was calling hotels, trying to track down Richard Delaney, growing more frantic with each dead end. At 10 p.m., Susie appeared in his study doorway. "Louis? We need to talk." He looked up from his book, arranging his expression to show mild concern. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Susie sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where they'd planned family vacations and discussed Jake's education and made decisions about their shared future. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Louis could see her gathering courage for whatever she was about to say. "I haven't been completely honest with you lately." Louis closed his book and gave her his full attention. "About what?" "The client meetings, the late nights at the office. Some of that wasn't entirely work-related." "I don't understand." Susie took a shaky breath. "I've been seeing someone. Not seriously, not. It's not love or anything like that. But I've been having an affair." Louis felt a strange sense of satisfaction at finally hearing her admit it, but he kept his expression neutral. "With whom?" "Jake's guidance counselor. Richard Delaney." "For how long?" 8 months. The words came out in a whisper, as if saying them quietly might minimize their impact. Louis leaned back in his chair, letting silence stretch between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured. "Why? I don't know. I was feeling trapped, I guess. Like my life was predetermined. Like I was just going through the motions of being a wife and mother without any real purpose of my own." "So you decided to sleep with our son's teacher." "It wasn't planned. It just happened. And then it kept happening because it made me feel alive again, like I was more than just Louis Spears' wife or Jake's mother." Louis studied her face, noting the mixture of guilt and defiance in her expression. Even in confession, Susie was trying to justify her choices, to make him understand that her betrayal had been a symptom of larger problems rather than a deliberate decision to destroy their family. "Where did you meet?" "Usually a hotel downtown. Sometimes his apartment." "And Jake?" Does he know? Susie's face went pale. God, no. We were very careful. There's no way he could know. Louis opened his desk drawer and removed Jake's bloodstained note, placing it on the desk between them. He wrote this the day of the accident. I found it in the wreckage. Susie read the note twice, her hands trembling. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her face. He's known all this time. He's known, and he's been carrying that burden because he loves both of us and didn't want to destroy our family. Louis, I'm not finished. Louis's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. I know about the hotel suite you rent twice a week. I know about the text messages, the emails, the photos you've sent each other. I know Richard Delaney is currently under investigation by the State Education Board for inappropriate relationships with parents. I know you've lied to your employer about your evening activities, and I know you've lied to me about virtually everything for the past 8 months. Susie stared at him in horror. How long have you known? Since the accident. The question is, what are we going to do about it? I'll end it. Right now, tonight. I'll never see him again. I'll never speak to him again. We can get counseling. We can work through this. Susie. Louis's voice cut through her desperate promises. Richard Delaney resigned from his position and disappeared. He's not answering your calls because he knows I discovered your affair, and he's terrified of what I might do to him. You confronted him? I destroyed him. His career is over. His reputation is ruined, and he'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder wondering when the other shoe will drop. Susie's face went white. What did you do? I protected my family. The question is, what are you willing to do to earn your way back into it? Anything. I'll do anything. Louis opened another drawer and removed a thick manila folder, placing it next to Jake's note. These are divorce papers. Complete dissolution of our marriage, full custody of Jake to me, division of assets according to our prenuptial agreement. You signed that agreement because you said you never wanted money to be an issue between us. Louis, please. If you sign these papers tonight, you can stay in this house until you find your own place. You can maintain your relationship with Jake under supervised conditions. You can keep your job and your reputation intact. And if I don't sign? Louis smiled, and for the first time since beginning this conversation, his mask slipped. Susie saw something in his expression that made her lean back in her chair. If you don't sign, I'll make sure that everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. Your law firm, your friends, your family, every parent at Jake's school. They'll all know that you're a woman who abandoned her family to sleep with a predator who specialized in seducing married women. You wouldn't. I spent my career building things, Susie. But I also know how to tear them down systematically. Your career, your reputation, your relationship with our son. I can destroy all of it if you force me to. Susie sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the depth of Louis's anger and the extent of his planning. She'd expected anger, accusations, perhaps an ultimatum about ending the affair. She hadn't expected this level of calculated revenge. I need time to think. No. Louis's voice was final. You had 8 months to think about what you were doing to our family. You had multiple opportunities to confess, to come clean, to try to save our marriage. Instead, you chose to continue lying until you were caught. He stood and walked around the desk, stopping directly in front of her chair. You have one chance to handle this with dignity. Sign the papers, accept responsibility for your choices, and we can end this quietly. Refuse, and I'll make sure your betrayal becomes a cautionary tale that people tell for years. Susie looked down at the divorce papers, her tears falling onto the legal documents that would end their 16-year marriage. What about Jake? What will we tell him? We'll tell him the truth. That you made choices that destroyed our family, but that both of us love him and want what's best for his future. He'll hate me. Maybe. But that will be a consequence of your actions, not mine. Louis returned to his chair and waited. In the silence, he could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking the passage of time, each tick bringing them closer to the moment when Susie would have to choose between accepting responsibility or facing complete destruction. Finally, with shaking hands, Susie picked up a pen and signed her name to the divorce papers. There's one more thing, Louis said as she finished. I want you out of this house by Sunday evening. Jake and I need space to figure out how to move forward without you. Susie nodded, unable to speak. She stood on unsteady legs and walked toward the door, then paused. Louis? I really am sorry. I know that doesn't change anything. but I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen." Lewis looked at his soon-to-be ex-wife, noting how small and defeated she appeared in their doorway. "The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Susie, but you still have to walk that road." After she left, Lewis sat alone in his study and felt the first true peace he'd experienced since reading Jake's note. Phase 1 was complete. Susie was out of their lives, and Jake would no longer have to carry the weight of her secrets. But Lewis wasn't finished. Richard Delaney was still out there somewhere, probably believing he'd escaped consequences for his actions. Lewis had made him a promise about what would happen if he ever contacted their family again, but some lessons required more permanent teaching. It was time for Phase 2. Chapter 6. Hunting the Hunter. Richard Delaney had always prided himself on his ability to disappear when situations became complicated. Over his 15-year career in education, he'd cultivated relationships with wealthy parents in 3 different states, always moving on before anyone recognized the patterns in his behavior. When marriages ended or suspicions arose, Richard simply submitted his resignation and relocated to a new school district where his credentials and charm could open new doors. But Lewis Spears was unlike any husband Richard had encountered before. Most men who discovered their wives' infidelities responded with predictable emotional outbursts, confrontations, threats, divorce proceedings that played out in public forums where Richard could mount defenses and cast himself as the victim of circumstance. Lewis had chosen a different approach, one that left Richard feeling hunted rather than merely inconvenienced. From his rented room in a cheap motel outside Youngstown, Ohio, Richard scrolled through online job boards and tried to convince himself that this was just another strategic retreat. He'd bounced back from similar situations before. The education market was always hungry for experienced guidance counselors, especially ones with his track record of college placement success. His LinkedIn profile still showcased glowing recommendations from previous employers who had no idea what he'd actually been doing with their parent communities. But every time Richard tried to craft a new application, he found himself returning to the photographs Lewis had shown him. The images were explicit enough to destroy any chance of future employment in education, but they also represented something more disturbing. Lewis Spears had been watching him for weeks, documenting his movements and activities with professional thoroughness. Richard's phone buzzed with another message from Susie, her 15th attempt to contact him since Thursday. He'd stopped reading her texts after the first few, recognizing the progression from confusion to panic to desperation. Whatever was happening on Lewis's end, Susie was clearly bearing the brunt of it, and Richard had no intention of exposing himself to additional risk by responding to her messages. What concerned him more were the other changes he'd noticed. His apartment lease had been mysteriously terminated, with his landlord citing violations of moral conduct clauses that Richard was certain hadn't existed in his original contract. His credit cards had been frozen pending investigation of suspicious activity. His bank had called about irregularities in his account that required immediate attention. Someone was systematically dismantling his life, and Richard suspected Lewis Spears had resources and connections that extended far beyond what a construction contractor should possess. Monday morning brought confirmation of Richard's worst fears. Harold Johnson, the private investigator Lewis had hired for digital forensics, had spent the weekend implementing Phase 2 of their plan. Using techniques that existed in legal gray areas, Harold had infiltrated Richard's online presence and begun distributing carefully selected evidence to key figures in his professional network. The first call came from Richard's former employer in Connecticut, where he'd worked before moving to Pittsburgh. The principal, Dr. Lena Carney, had received an anonymous email containing photographs and text messages that suggested Richard's relationship with parents had extended far beyond appropriate professional boundaries. "Richard, I need to ask you directly. Did you have inappropriate relationships with parents while you were employed here?" "Lena, I don't know what you've heard, but I've seen photographs, Richard. Explicit photographs that show you in compromising positions with at least 2 different women who had children in our district." Richard's stomach dropped. The photographs could only have come from Lewis, but how had he obtained images from Richard's previous employment? "Those pictures are fake. Someone is trying to frame me. The metadata on these images shows they were taken at locations and times that correspond to your work schedule here. Richard, I have to notify the state licensing board. This is a criminal matter now." The call ended, and Richard stared at his phone in disbelief. Lewis hadn't just discovered the current affair. He'd somehow uncovered Richard's entire pattern of behavior across multiple school districts. The man was conducting a professional investigation that revealed years of carefully hidden misconduct. By Tuesday, Richard's phone was ringing constantly with calls from former colleagues, administrators, and parents who'd received similar evidence packets. Each conversation followed the same pattern: shock, disappointment, and the inevitable conclusion that Richard Delaney was a predator who'd used his position to exploit vulnerable families. Richard tried calling Lewis directly, hoping to negotiate some kind of arrangement that would end his systematic destruction. The call went straight to voicemail, and Lewis's recorded message was maddeningly professional. "You've reached Lewis Spears. Please leave a detailed message, and I'll return your call as soon as possible. Lewis, this is Richard Delaney. I think we need to talk. What you're doing goes beyond just punishing me for the affair. You're destroying my entire life, my ability to earn a living, my future. I understand you're angry, but this is..." Richard stopped recording, realizing that any message he left could be used as evidence of harassment or admission of guilt. Lewis had created a situation where Richard couldn't defend himself without incriminating himself further. Wednesday brought a visit from two FBI agents investigating reports of interstate crimes involving the exploitation of minors. The charges weren't related to his affair with Susie. They concerned allegations that Richard had used his position to gain access to families for purposes that extended beyond educational guidance, including inappropriate contact with students. "Mr. Delaney, we've received reports that suggest a pattern of behavior spanning multiple states and involving potential violations of federal law." Richard's hands shook as he reviewed the evidence they presented. Someone had compiled a comprehensive file documenting his movements, communications, and relationships across his entire career. The investigation wasn't just about inappropriate relationships with parents. It encompassed allegations of grooming behavior with students, financial exploitation of families, and abuse of his professional position for personal gain. "I want a lawyer," Richard said. "That's your right. But I should tell you that we have cooperation from multiple witnesses who are willing to testify about your behavior. This isn't going away, Mr. Delaney." After the agents left, Richard sat in his motel room and tried to understand how his life had collapsed so completely in just 1 week. Lewis Spears wasn't just an angry husband. He was a man with resources, connections, and the ability to orchestrate a comprehensive investigation that revealed crimes Richard thought he'd hidden forever. Thursday evening, Richard's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. When he answered, Lewis's voice was calm and measured. "Hello, Richard. I thought it was time we had a conversation. Lewis, you have to stop this. I understand you're angry about the affair, but what you're doing is destroying my life. Your life was destroyed the moment you decided to target my family. What I'm doing is simply revealing the truth about who you are." "The FBI came to see me. They're talking about federal charges, Richard. Interstate crimes. This goes way beyond a simple affair." "I know. Fascinating what a thorough investigation can reveal about someone's true character." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "You orchestrated this entire thing. I simply provided evidence to the appropriate authorities. What they choose to do with that evidence is up to them. What do you want from me?" "Nothing. You're finished, Richard. Your career is over, your reputation is destroyed, and you'll spend the next several years in federal prison. I wanted you to know that this wasn't random justice. This was personal revenge. Lewis, please. You made a fundamental error in judgment, Richard. You assumed I was just another cuckolded husband who would react emotionally and predictably. Instead, you discovered what happens when someone with resources and patience decides to hunt you systematically." The line went dead, and Richard stared at his phone in the growing darkness of his motel room. For the first time since this nightmare began, he understood that Lewis Spears hadn't been acting impulsively or emotionally. Every step had been calculated, every action designed to achieve maximum devastation. Richard had thought he was a predator, someone who identified and exploited weaknesses in others. But he'd encountered a different kind of predator, one who was smarter, more ruthless, and infinitely more dangerous than anyone Richard had ever imagined. Friday morning, Richard checked out of his motel and drove toward the state line, hoping to put distance between himself and Lewis's reach. But at the Pennsylvania border, State police pulled him over and placed him under arrest on charges related to the federal investigation. As they read him his rights, Richard saw a familiar figure standing near one of the police cars. Lewis Spears had come to watch his enemy's final defeat, and his expression showed no satisfaction or triumph, only the cold professionalism of someone who'd completed a necessary job. "Mr. Delaney," Lewis said as Richard was led toward the police car in handcuffs. "I told you what would happen if you ever threatened my family again. Consider this a lesson in keeping promises." Richard was placed in the back seat of the police cruiser, and as they drove away, he watched Lewis disappear in the distance. The man who destroyed his life returned to his truck and drove home to the family he protected, leaving Richard to face the consequences of choices that had seemed so harmless just 2 weeks earlier. Lewis had proven that some betrayals carried prices too high for forgiveness, and some predators eventually met hunters who were better at the game than they were. Chapter 7. Ashes of the Old Life. The house felt different with Susie gone, as if her departure had altered the fundamental atmosphere of rooms where Lewis had spent 16 years building what he believed was a happy marriage. Jake moved through their home with the careful steps of someone adjusting to a new reality, helping his father pack away photographs and personal items that had once represented their family's shared history. Lewis had given Susie until Sunday evening to collect her belongings and find somewhere else to live. She'd chosen to stay with her sister Martha in Philadelphia, at least temporarily, while she figured out her next steps. The divorce papers had been filed Monday morning, with Stanley Cohen ensuring that the proceedings would be as swift and private as possible. "Dad," Jake stood in the doorway of Lewis's study, holding a framed photo of their last family vacation to Ocean City. "What should I do with these?" Lewis looked at the image of the three of them on the beach, all smiles and suntanned faces, taken just 4 months earlier when he'd still believed his wife loved him. "Pack them away for now. Someday you might want to remember the good times we had before everything changed. Do you think Mom really loved us? Or was she just pretending the whole time?" It was the question Lewis had been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of how they would all move forward from this betrayal. Jake needed honest answers, but he also needed to maintain some faith in human relationships. "I think she loved us in her own way," Lewis said carefully. "But I also think she loved herself more, and when those two things came into conflict, she chose herself. That's not really love, is it?" "No, son, it's not." Tuesday brought news that Richard Delaney had been arrested at the Pennsylvania state line on federal charges related to his pattern of exploitation across multiple school districts. The investigation Lewis had initiated had uncovered evidence of crimes spanning nearly a decade, involving dozens of families and potentially several underage students. Lewis felt no satisfaction at the news, only a sense of completion. Richard Delaney would spend the next 10 to 15 years in federal prison, where men who preyed on children and families were not treated kindly by other inmates. Justice would be served through official channels, but it would be justice informed by Lewis's personal intervention. Wednesday evening, Jake approached his father with a question that surprised them both. "Dad, I want to testify at the trial." "Against Mr. Delaney." Lewis looked up from the construction plans he'd been reviewing. "Why?" "Because I saw what he did to our family. I saw how he manipulated Mom, how he made her believe lies about herself and about us. Other kids might have seen things too, and if I speak up, maybe they'll find the courage to tell the truth." Lewis studied his son's face, noting the determination mixed with fear. Jake was 14 years old, but the events of the past month had aged him in ways that couldn't be measured in years. Testifying would mean telling a courtroom full of strangers about your mother's affair. It would mean having defense attorneys ask you difficult questions about things you shouldn't have had to witness. "I know, but if I don't speak up, he might hurt other families the way he hurt ours." Lewis felt a surge of pride in his son's courage, tempered by protective instincts that wanted to shield Jake from additional trauma. "Let me talk to the prosecutors. If they think your testimony would be helpful, we'll discuss it further." That weekend, Lewis and Jake drove to his sister Laura's house for Sunday dinner, their first family gathering since the divorce proceedings began. Laura and her husband Scott had been careful not to ask too many questions, but Lewis could see the concern in their faces as they watched Jake navigate his new reality. "How are you holding up?" Laura asked as they cleaned dishes together after dinner. "Better than I expected," Lewis replied honestly. "Jake is handling this with more maturity than most adults would show." "And you?" How are you handling it? Lewis considered the question carefully. I'm not angry anymore. That phase ended when I decided to take action instead of just feeling sorry for myself. What's next? We rebuild. Jake and I create a new normal that doesn't include room for people who betray the people they claim to love. That sounds lonely. Maybe, but it's honest. Monday brought a call from Andre Herrera, Susie's former boss at the law firm. Lewis, I wanted to give you a heads up. We had to terminate Susie's employment. The investigation into her activities revealed that she'd been lying about her work schedule for months, and that calls into question her trustworthiness with client matters. Lewis wasn't surprised. Susie's web of lies had extended into every area of her life, and each exposure created additional consequences. I understand. Is there anything else I need to know? The State Bar Association is reviewing her license. Dishonesty about professional activities can result in suspension or disbarment, especially when it involves conduct that reflects poorly on the legal profession. After the call ended, Lewis realized that Susie's punishment was continuing to compound even without his direct intervention. Her choices had created a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond their marriage, destroying her career and professional reputation in ways that would take years to rebuild. Tuesday evening, Lewis received an unexpected visitor. Martha Plummer stood on his doorstep, her face showing the strain of the past 2 weeks. Lewis, may I come in? We need to talk. They sat in his living room, the same space where he'd entertained Richard Delaney months earlier, where family celebrations and quiet evenings had once created the illusion of domestic happiness. Susie told me what happened, Martha began. The affair, the divorce, everything. Lewis waited for her to continue, curious about what Martha hoped to accomplish with this visit. She's destroyed, Lewis. Completely broken. She's lost her job. Her license is under review. She has no money and nowhere to go except my guest room. Those are consequences of her choices, not punishments I imposed. But you could help her. You could show mercy, maybe work out some kind of arrangement. No. Lewis's voice was final. Susie made her choices with full knowledge of what she was risking. I won't rescue her from the consequences. What about Jake? He needs his mother. Jake needs stability and honesty. He needs to know that actions have consequences and that the people who love him can be trusted. Susie can't provide any of those things. Martha's composure cracked. She made a mistake, Lewis. One mistake that she's paying for with her entire life. It wasn't one mistake. It was hundreds of deliberate choices made over 8 months. Each lie, each secret meeting, each time she came home and pretended to love our family while betraying us. Those were all individual decisions. Everyone deserves forgiveness. Everyone deserves consequences. Forgiveness is earned through acknowledgement, repentance, and changed behavior. Susie has shown none of those things. Martha left without achieving whatever reconciliation she'd hoped for, and Lewis felt no guilt about his refusal to soften his position. Mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford when it came to protecting his son's future. Wednesday brought the news Lewis had been expecting. Richard Delaney had accepted a plea bargain that would send him to federal prison for 12 years. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case based on evidence from multiple jurisdictions, and Delaney's attorneys had advised him that trial would likely result in a longer sentence. He'll be transferred to a federal facility in West Virginia. The prosecutor informed Lewis during their phone call. He'll serve at least 10 years before becoming eligible for parole. What about restitution for the families he victimized? That's part of the plea agreement. He'll be required to pay damages to all identified victims, though given his financial situation, the actual recovery will be minimal. Lewis didn't care about the money. The real satisfaction came from knowing that Richard Delaney would spend the next decade in an environment where his crimes were known and his safety was never guaranteed. Federal prison was particularly hard on men who preyed on children and families. That evening, Lewis and Jake sat on their back deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was the same view they'd enjoyed as a family for years, but now it belonged to just the two of them. Dad, do you ever miss her? Jake asked quietly. I miss the woman I thought she was, Lewis replied. But that woman was mostly an illusion. I miss the idea of having a complete family, but I don't miss the lies and the betrayal. Do you think you'll ever get married again? Lewis considered the question. I don't know. Right now, I'm focused on being the best father I can be and building a life that's honest and stable. Everything else is secondary. I'm glad you didn't take her back. The statement surprised Lewis. Why? Because it would have taught me that you can treat people badly and they'll forgive you anyway. That there aren't really consequences for hurting the people who love you. Lewis looked at his son with new respect. Jake understood the deeper implications of forgiveness versus accountability, concepts that many adults struggled to grasp. You're wise beyond your years, son. I learned from the best. As darkness settled over their property, Lewis felt a sense of peace that had been absent from his life for months. The old life was truly dead, its ashes scattered by choices that couldn't be undone. But from those ashes, he and Jake were building something new, a relationship based on truth, respect, and the knowledge that some betrayals were too fundamental to survive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Lewis Spears was exactly where he belonged, home with his son, surrounded by the honest silence of a life lived without lies. Chapter 8. The Price of Betrayal. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Lewis stood in the conference room of Stanley Cohen's law office, reviewing the final settlement documents that would close the last chapter of his marriage to Susie. The prenuptial agreement they'd signed 16 years earlier had proved its worth, protecting the assets Lewis had built through decades of hard work while ensuring that Susie received only what she'd contributed to their shared wealth. The house, the construction business, and Jake's college funds remain entirely under your control, Stanley explained as they reviewed each document. Susie receives her 401k, half the value of the joint savings account, and 6 months of temporary alimony while she reestablishes her career. Assuming she can reestablish her career, Lewis replied. The State Bar Association had suspended Susie's license pending a full ethics review, and her termination from the law firm had made finding new employment nearly impossible. There's one more matter we need to discuss, Stanley continued. Susie's attorney has requested a modification to the custody arrangement. She wants overnight visitation rights with Jake. Lewis's expression hardened. Denied. Lewis, the courts generally favor maintaining relationships between children and both parents. The courts also consider the best interests of the child. Jake has explicitly stated that he doesn't want overnight visits with his mother. It was true. In the 3 months since Susie had moved to Philadelphia, Jake had agreed to supervised visits every other weekend, but he'd been clear about not wanting to stay overnight at Martha's house. The visits were awkward, filled with Susie's attempts to rebuild a relationship that had been fundamentally damaged by her betrayal. Jake's old enough for his preferences to carry significant weight with the judge, Stanley acknowledged. But you should be prepared for Susie to argue that you've influenced his decision. I've never told Jake what to think about his mother. I've simply refused to lie to him about what she did to our family. That afternoon, Lewis picked up Jake from school and noticed his son's subdued mood during the drive home. Jake had been doing well academically and socially, but the approaching summer break meant more time for reflection on how dramatically their lives had changed. Mom called me today, Jake said as they pulled into their driveway. Lewis felt his jaw tighten. Susie was supposed to coordinate any contact through Lewis, not call Jake directly. What did she want? She wants me to spend 2 weeks with her this summer. She found an apartment in Philadelphia and thinks it would be good for us to have quality time together. How do you feel about that? Jake was quiet for a long moment. I feel like she's trying to pretend that everything can go back to normal if we just spend enough time together. But it can't, can it? No, son. It can't. She keeps saying she's sorry, that she made a mistake, that she loves me and wants us to be a family again. But she never talks about what she did to you. It's like she thinks her relationship with me is separate from how she treated you. Lewis parked the car and turned to face his son. What do you want to do about the visit? I don't want to go, but I feel guilty saying that because she's still my mom. Guilt is a normal reaction, but it shouldn't determine your choices. You're old enough to decide what kind of relationship you want with your mother, and that relationship has to be based on who she really is, not who she wants you to believe she is. That evening, Lewis called Susie to address her direct contact with Jake. We agreed that all communication would go through me, he said when she answered. He's my son, Lewis. I have a right to talk to him. You have limited rights that are defined by our custody agreement. Calling him at school to pressure him about summer visits violates the spirit of that agreement. I'm not pressuring him. I'm trying to maintain a relationship with my child. A relationship built on guilt and manipulation isn't healthy for anyone. You've turned him against me, Susie accused, her voice rising. You've poisoned his mind with your anger and your need for revenge. Louis felt his temper flare, but kept his voice controlled. I've told him the truth about what you did. If that's turned him against you, the problem isn't my honesty, it's your actions. I made a mistake, Louis. I'm trying to rebuild my life, to be a better person. Can't you give me a chance to reconnect with my son? You can have a relationship with Jake if he wants one, but it will be on his terms, not yours. And it will be based on who you are today, not promises about who you might become tomorrow. The call ended with both of them frustrated, but Louis felt no obligation to make the situation easier for his ex-wife. Susie's consequences were still accumulating, and she seemed to believe that enough time and persistence would eventually restore what she'd destroyed. Thursday brought a call from Harold Johnson with an update on Richard Delaney's situation. He's been transferred to the federal facility in West Virginia. Word is that he's having a hard time adjusting to prison life. Problems with other inmates? Among other things. Men who prey on children and families aren't popular in any prison, but federal facilities have their own hierarchies. Delaney's trying to keep a low profile, but his case was high profile enough that his crimes are common knowledge. Louis felt no sympathy for Richard Delaney's difficulties. The man had spent years exploiting vulnerable families, using his position and charm to manipulate women while destroying marriages and traumatizing children. Prison was exactly where he belonged. There's something else, Harold continued. I've been monitoring Susie's communications, and she's been in contact with other women who were involved with Delaney. For what purpose? Seems like she's trying to organize some kind of support group for his victims. She's been reaching out to the wives from other school districts, trying to create a network of women who were manipulated by him. Louis understood immediately what Susie was attempting. By casting herself as a victim rather than a willing participant, she was trying to rewrite the narrative of her betrayal. If she could convince others, and herself, that Richard Delaney had manipulated her into the affair, then her guilt became diminished and her path to redemption became clearer. Is she getting any response? Mixed. Some of the women want nothing to do with her. Others seem interested in the idea that they were victims rather than willing participants. Louis ended the call and sat in his study, looking out at the garden Susie had planted 3 years earlier. The roses were blooming despite being neglected, their beauty persisting even as the woman who'd planted them worked to escape responsibility for destroying the family that had once enjoyed their fragrance. Friday evening brought Jake's decision about the summer visit. I'll go for 1 week instead of 2, he told Louis. But I want to stay in a hotel, not at her apartment. And I want you to pick me up if things get uncomfortable. Louis admired his son's diplomatic approach. Jake was giving his mother an opportunity to prove she'd changed while protecting himself from being trapped in an uncomfortable situation. Are you sure that's what you want? I think I need to see who she is now. Not who she was before, or who she's trying to become, but who she actually is today. Saturday morning, Louis received a call from Dr. Ernest Elder at Jake's school. Mr. Spears, I wanted to update you on the Richard Delaney investigation. The final report identified 7 families across 3 states who were directly affected by his misconduct. Any additional charges? The federal sentence covers everything, but the school district has implemented new policies for background checks and ongoing monitoring of staff interactions with families. Too little, too late for the families who were already victimized. Yes, and we're acutely aware of that failure. The board has established a fund to provide counseling and support services for affected families. Louis appreciated the gesture, but he knew that money couldn't repair the damage Richard Delaney had caused. 7 families had been shattered by one man's predatory behavior, and the ripple effects would continue for years. That afternoon, Louis and Jake worked together in the garden, replacing some of the plants Susie had chosen with varieties they selected together. It was therapeutic work, the kind of physical activity that allowed for conversation without forcing it. Dad, do you think people can really change? Jake asked as they planted new shrubs. I think people can change their behavior if they're truly committed to it. But changing who you are fundamentally? That's much harder. Do you think Mom has changed? Louis considered his answer carefully. I think she's learned that her actions have consequences. Whether that's changed her character or just made her more careful remains to be seen. The week I spend with her this summer, that's going to tell us a lot, isn't it? It will tell you what you need to know about what kind of relationship is possible with her going forward. As they worked, Lewis reflected on how much their lives had improved since eliminating the toxicity of Susie's lies and Richard Delaney's manipulation. The house felt peaceful, their conversations were honest, and Jake was flourishing in an environment where he didn't have to keep secrets or navigate between conflicting loyalties. The price of betrayal had been higher than Susie had ever imagined when she made her first choice to meet Richard Delaney at that downtown hotel. She'd lost her marriage, her career, her reputation, and her relationship with her son. But perhaps most importantly, she'd lost the respect of the one person whose opinion should have mattered most to her. Lewis Spears had never forgiven betrayal, and he never would. That inflexibility, which some might see as a character flaw, had become the foundation of a life built on truth and accountability. He and Jake were building something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed, and they were doing it without room for people who couldn't be trusted. The garden they were planting would bloom for years to come, tended by hands that had learned the value of patience, honesty, and the strength that comes from refusing to compromise with those who would destroy what you've built. Chapter 9: New Foundations. 1 year after discovering Jake's blood-stained note in the wreckage of their car, Lewis stood in the same hospital corridor where he'd made his first decisions about revenge and justice. Today's visit was different. Jake was here for the removal of the cast from his final surgery, a minor procedure to address lingering effects from their accident that had revealed so much more than broken bones. "Dad, does it hurt?" Jake asked, flexing his newly freed arm as the doctor completed his examination. "What? Looking back on everything that happened, does it hurt to remember how different our lives were a year ago?" Lewis considered the question as they walked through the hospital parking lot toward the same model Mercedes he'd replaced after the accident. "It doesn't hurt anymore. It's more like looking at someone else's life, someone who believed things that weren't true. Do you miss believing them?" "Sometimes. Ignorance can be comfortable, but truth is stronger." The drive home took them past the highway spot where their accident had occurred, now marked only by repaired guardrail and fresh asphalt. Lewis had driven this route hundreds of times since that October evening, but today Jake pointed out the location. "That's where everything started, isn't it?" "No," Lewis replied. "Everything started 8 months before that, when your mother made her first choice to betray our family. The accident just revealed what was already broken." At home, Lewis found a letter waiting for Martha Plummer. Susie's sister had been persistent in her attempts to broker some kind of reconciliation, never quite understanding that Lewis's forgiveness wasn't a resource that could be negotiated or purchased with enough time and contrition. The letter contained an update on Susie's situation. She'd found part-time work as a paralegal while her law license remained under review. She'd completed counseling to address what Martha described as the underlying issues that led to her poor choices, and she'd maintained steady contact with Jake during his monthly visits to Philadelphia. Martha's letter concluded with another plea for mercy. "Susie has paid a heavy price for her mistakes. She's lost her career, her marriage, her home, and her daily relationship with her son. Surely that's enough punishment for anyone. Jake needs his mother in his life, and Susie needs the chance to rebuild her relationship with both of you." Lewis handed the letter to Jake, who read it with the same careful attention he'd learned to apply to all communications from his mother's family. "What do you think?" Lewis asked. "I think Aunt Martha still doesn't understand what Mom actually did," Jake replied. "She keeps calling it mistakes and poor choices, like Mom accidentally forgot to pay bills or something." "What would you call it?" "Betrayal. She betrayed you. She betrayed me. And she betrayed the idea that families are supposed to protect each other instead of hurting each other." Lewis felt pride in his son's clarity, tempered by sadness that a 15-year-old had been forced to develop such sophisticated understanding of human nature. Jake had spent the past year learning lessons about loyalty and consequence that most people didn't master until much later in life. That evening, Lewis received a call from Stanley Cohen with news about Richard Delaney's latest legal troubles. He's been charged with additional crimes that occurred while he was in federal custody. Apparently, he attempted to manipulate other inmates and guards using the same psychological techniques he used on families. "What kind of charges?" "Extortion, intimidation, attempting to organize contraband distribution." The man can't help himself. He sees any social situation as an opportunity to exploit someone. Lewis wasn't surprised. Predators like Richard Delaney didn't change their fundamental nature just because their environment changed. They simply adapted their techniques to new circumstances while pursuing the same goals of control and exploitation. What's his exposure? An additional 5 to 7 years, assuming he's convicted. At this point, he's looking at spending most of his remaining productive years in federal custody. After the call, Lewis reflected on how completely Richard Delaney had destroyed himself through his own choices. The man who'd thought he was clever enough to manipulate wealthy families had discovered that true intelligence meant understanding when you were outmatched. Lewis had been a predator hunting another predator, and experience had triumphed over arrogance. Saturday brought Jake's monthly visit with Susie in Philadelphia. Lewis drove him to the train station, a routine they'd established that gave Jake independence while ensuring his safety. "How are you feeling about seeing her?" Lewis asked as they waited on the platform. "Different than last time. I think I'm finally understanding that the mom I remember from before is gone. The woman I visit now is someone different, someone who's trying to figure out who she wants to be. Is that good or bad? It's honest. And I'd rather have an honest relationship with who she actually is than a fake relationship with who I wish she was." Lewis watched his son board the train with the confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate complex emotional terrain without losing his sense of self. Jake had survived his family's destruction and emerged stronger, more perceptive, and more capable of protecting himself from future manipulations. Sunday evening, Jake returned with stories about his visit that revealed more growth and insight. "Mom's different," he reported as they ate dinner together. "She's sadder, but she's also more real. She actually talked about what she did instead of just saying she was sorry." "What did she say?" "She said she was selfish and stupid, that she convinced herself she deserved excitement and attention more than she deserved to keep her family together. She said she thought she could have both, and when she realized she couldn't, she chose the wrong thing." "How did that make you feel?" "Relieved, I guess. It's the first time she's actually admitted what she did instead of making excuses about being manipulated or making mistakes." "Does that change anything for you?" Jake considered the question carefully. "It makes me think she might actually understand what she did. But it doesn't make me want to live with her or pretend that everything can go back to normal." "That's a healthy perspective." "She asked me if I thought you would ever forgive her." Lewis felt his jaw tighten. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that forgiveness isn't the right word for what she wants. She wants to be rescued from the consequences of her choices, but that's not the same thing as forgiveness." Lewis studied his son's face, amazed at the depth of his understanding. "What else did you tell her?" "I told her that you're not angry anymore, but you're also not going to pretend that what she did wasn't important. That you've built a life based on truth and accountability, and there's no room in that life for people who can't be trusted." "How did she respond?" "She cried, but not the manipulative crying she used to do when she wanted something. Real crying, like she was finally understanding what she actually lost." That night, Lewis sat in his study and thought about the year that had passed since discovering Susie's betrayal. He'd set out to destroy the people who'd betrayed his family, and he'd succeeded beyond his own expectations. Richard Delaney was spending his prime years in federal prison, facing additional charges that would extend his sentence well into old age. Susie had lost her career, her home, her social standing, and her daily relationship with her son. But more importantly, Lewis had protected Jake from the ongoing toxicity of their lies and rebuilt their family on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. They'd created a life that was smaller but stronger, quieter but more genuine. Lewis had never forgiven betrayal, and he never would. That inflexibility had cost him a marriage, but it had saved his relationship with his son and preserved his own integrity. Some people might see his refusal to show mercy as a character flaw, but Lewis understood it as a strength that had allowed him to build something lasting from the wreckage of what others had destroyed. The man who'd once believed in second chances and the power of forgiveness had learned that some violations were too fundamental to repair. But he'd also learned that the end of one story could become the beginning of something better, something built on the solid ground of truth rather than the shifting sand of convenient lies. Outside his window, the garden he and Jake had planted together was preparing for winter, its roots growing deeper and stronger in soil that had been cleared of old growth that could no longer thrive. Come spring, it would bloom more beautifully than anything that had come before, tended by hands that had learned the difference between mercy and wisdom, between forgiveness and justice. Lewis Spears had chosen justice, and in doing so, he'd chosen a future where betrayal had no power and truth had no limits. It was a harder path than forgiveness might have been, but it was a path that led to something that would last, a life built on foundations that could not be shaken by those who would tear them down. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.